Thank you all for coming to talk about Hindi literature and translation. First of all, just want to give a little bit of an overview about the state of literary translation in the US. The good news is it's getting better. The bad news is it's pretty terrible. And when I say pretty terrible, I mean that in a good year, about 3% of all literary titles in all belletric genres from all languages, including retranslations, are voices from other languages coming into English, right? In a good year, that it's about 500 or 600 titles. Compare that with, for example, a country like Germany, which has the highest percentage of translated literature. They don't sort of even think of in terms of, is this translated, is this originally in German, where the figure is about 60%. So aside from the obvious implications about, if you think about, if you only listen to music originating from America, or eat food originating from America, or watch movies originating from America, or English, as a language, what that might mean not only for the arts and your kind of aesthetic experiences, but also it has a lot of political implications about what sort of voices we're hearing, what sort of perspectives we're getting. As a subset of this question of translation are translations from South Asian languages, where in some ways, in many ways, the situation is even a little bit more dire. And part of this, it's a very complex issue that we won't have time to discuss today, but part of it, unfortunately, has to do with the great success that a lot of South Asian writers who are writing in English have, because the way that the market works, unfortunately, the shelf space on Barnes & Nobles is sort of a zero-sum game, right? So for every title, for all the wonderful, South Asian writers writing in English, and I mean, we can all name our favorite ones, these voices that should absolutely be heard, sometimes that actually means that there's one less space available for a South Asian writer writing in English, or writing in a language other than English. I happen to be lucky, we all happen to be lucky enough to be sitting in the same room today with Uday Prakash, who I count as a very close friend of mine, and we'll talk a little bit about how we met and the translator-writer relationship. But Uday is the first living Hindi novelist to be published by a US publishing house in over a generation, with The Girl with the Golden Parasol, translated from the Hindi of Pili Chatriwadi Larki. And this was 3 years ago. So just think about that for a second. I mean, if you think about any other language, Japanese, Chinese, Russian, certainly French and Spanish, if you can imagine an entire generation gap where there's no living novelist published in the US. So that's a problem that many people, many talented translators and many writers are working on fixing right now. So maybe we can talk about some of those questions a little bit later, this sort of ecosystem, if you're interested in what it takes to bring a translation to the shelves, to you, the readers. But very quickly, before I hand over the microphone to Uday and John, I just want to quickly talk about how I got interested in Hindi, my study with Hindi, my sort of experience, and how I became a Hindi translator, as well as a writer, and finally meeting Uday about 10 years ago. So my first contact with India was going to India after high school with my best friend from high school, whose family was the first Indian family to settle in Buffalo, New York in 1960, which is quite impressive considering that was before the 1965 Immigration Acts, when the quota for Indians in this country was still a total of 100 people per year. So they were the first Indian family. They were from Kerala originally. And we visited India after high school with his family, and I decided I wanted to go back. I fell in love with the country on many different levels. I wanted to study comparative literature, and I needed a second language, so Hindi seemed like the obvious choice to fulfill the twin notions of wanting to do comp lit and go back to India and have an experience. So fast forward many years, I graduate. Comp lit in translation, I retranslated an iconic Hindi writer, the grandfather of Hindi Urdu fiction, Premchand, for my senior thesis. And then afterwards I worked as an interpreter for the International Committee of the Red Cross, visiting detainees in Kashmir in the mid to late 90s. If anyone's seen the film Haider, that takes place roughly at the time that I was there. And then I was writing the whole time, writing fiction, and knowing a second language and being a fiction writer, it just seemed natural that I would be drawn to translation. So when I later started an MFA program and wanted to translate a contemporary writer, I remember the day I was in the stacks of Butler Library at Columbia University, just picking books off the shelf, and it was love at first sight with reading one of Uday's stories called Paul Gomra and his motor scooter. Paul Gomra's car scooter. I mean, the voice was unlike any other voice I'd ever heard in Hindi literature, and it just drew me instantly. And luckily I was able to get a grant to go visit Uday a couple of years after that. And maybe I'll pass it over to you to talk about some of your experiences with translation and your translator.
No, yeah, I exactly remember. It was I think the year 2002 or 3 when he wrote me the first email that I want to translate your Paul Gomra scooter. So I said, that was the first time, and I referred the name of one of my friends who was working in CSDS. So I said, this is already translated there in America by one other translator. He is also my wonderful friend, Robert A. Hookstick. He said, yes, I know that, and I have read that, but Bob belongs to another generation. He is almost like my teacher. So I am translating in my own way. So I asked Bob, should he translate? Bob was very happy. And you can compare the text of these two translation texts, TT. And there is a difference. They translated by two American friends in the same English, but they are different. And possibly when I try to find out what are the reasons, I feel because Bob is of my age. He's 2 months younger to me. I was getting retired soon. So he calls me Badu, he's the elder brother, and I call him Chotu, and he said I'm your Chotu, or the younger brother. But he's not a creative writer, he's a great scholar. He knows Sanskrit, he knows Urdu, Persian, Arabic, Armenian, and he was a member of ALTA, American Translators Association. And he knows a lot about the scholastic work which has been done in Indian languages. But he is a scholar. He loved my writings, he translated it. And he has translated many of short stories. But when Jason translated, he was a young translator, very young translator, almost the third generation. And he himself is a creative writer. And he has a lot of concern about what is happening in South Asia. And he had already visited there in Jammu and Kashmir and working for political detainees. And he used to hear and speak to the common usage of the language spoken by people. So in a way he transcended the limits of literary textual translation language. So I was really happy, but I had my apprehensions because that short story has a lot of ironies and humor and satires. So I thought, I wrote it when globalization was taking over to my country. And everywhere there was irony, humor is coming up because a pre-modern society is being assaulted by something very new technologically and on all spheres. So I was apprehending whether people in America would understand the kind of humor we have over here. But then he said, yes, I decided to in New York, I think, somewhere.
California.
California. And people understand, people laugh, applauded, and they understand that. So I developed some confidence. And then he started translating continuously. And one of the translations which really changed my life as a career, I should admit it, confess it. I wrote a novel, it was a love story in a serialized manner. The Peeli Chhatri Wali Ladki. And it created a lot of controversy over there because it was an argument against the caste system we have over there. And it was a new argument because instead of going back to scriptures and what has been said about caste system in religious books, I argued from the basis of genetic interactions between the races and caste in India. And I had read some books also by Anthropological Survey of India that from 13% it is 87% of the interactions, genetic interactions have already happened in India since last 3,000 years. So there is no genetic basis of this caste system. So it was the first time it was a love story, and people got enraged, and then they started the kind of slanders, and 35 assignments were cancelled, and those were my really dark days. And I fell sick and developed some backbone problems. When you are in problem, a lot of things start happening to you, your body. And that time he translated Girl with the Golden Parasol, and he informed me that he has got a pen grant for the translation and is coming to India, and he came in 2005. And since then, you know, through translation, it's not only translating an original text into another language. You are, by translating, you empower the original author. And it has happened many a times with other dissident writers in other countries. So translation is, on one context you look at is in a very theoretical manner, like translating OT to TT, original text into translation text. But it has also some very invisible role to play in the lives of the author and also in the lives of translator. So this morning I was telling the same thing, that I was reading one essay along with some young writer like you. He said recently, he said, suppose if Gogol had written, he has written Nose, the famous short story. Had he been born in America and he had been American, and now writing in 2015, how would have he written the same story, Nose? So this is a big question. You know, it's asked very simply, but it's really a big question. You are transposing many things. Like he has cited some horse carriages, transformed into aeroplanes or taxis or cars or something like that. And those things. So when he was translating, he was really, the way he is sensitive, I should really say, sometimes I say that the translator is an extension of the original author. Unless he does that, and unless he performs that way, it is difficult to translate. And I think it is the soul of, I don't know if this soul has any meaning, but like Ghalib has said, gap. So aate hain mazamin kisi ghaib se ghalib. So there is something that has to be linked between the author and translator. Only then a good text in translation comes out. And otherwise it's kind of a professional thing like you do in comparative literatures, and you keep on spurning out translated text of many writers. So I feel really satisfied and I'm happy. And I feel that possibly this is the first time that our voices are being heard over here. And we are not at par with other Indian English writers, but okay. This started happening, and we hope for future better.
There's a very interesting report that was published by International Pen several years ago called "To Be Translated or Not to Be," and it talks about this interesting and somewhat perverse phenomenon and it happens all the time, where writers writing in a language other than English. We know English is this kind of the gateway language to the world, right? It provides exposure, validation, although there's this interesting characterization of English in this report as an invasive species, which is kind of a separate question and very interesting. But it happens that writers writing in a language other than English often aren't validated in their own languages, get the recognition that they deserve until they're translated into English, having some kind of acclaim and exposure in a Western market outside of their countries, and then it has kind of a boomerang effect. I mean, it shouldn't be that way, at all. But so it's kind of this mixed blessing in a way. So John, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you started with literary translation and your recent experiences in the top secret world of Hindi publishing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. But first, I'd like to comment on a couple of things which they've said. Before we all met here, Jason and I kind of were a little bit frustrated with the title of the Intangibles and Untranslatables because we believe that actually things can be translated, and this is an opportunity to talk about opportunities.
I'm sorry. I just have to be. one of my favorite essayists and translators, Elliot Weinberger, has this wonderful quote. He has many wonderful quotes, but one of them is, "There's no such thing as something that's untranslatable. It just hasn't found the right translator."
And so what struck me is, they were speaking earlier, going immediately to Uday, his first translator was Robert Huckstead, and he was my thesis advisor at the University of Virginia. And so there's a lot of lore built around our professor. So this could be gossip, who knows? I think this is true, so don't take this to be entirely factual. But from what I heard, he initially went to India to be a tabla player, and tablas are a form of drum. And then once he was he later discovered he was better at language than he was at tabla, and then things went from there. But then to compare Professor Huckstead, because it takes a lot of spirit and a lot of courage to go to India to learn how to play the drums. Jason also said that when he went on his high school trip, he fell in love with the country. It was actually the love for the culture and the country, which then led to the next question, how do I learn the language? Which may lead to then the third question, what literature exists in this language? And so, for me, that's a question which I always had. In our Hindi classes, we're exposed to a lot of really great Hindi writers, and yet, it seems to be a shame that we're the only ones exposed to them. And so then we also begin to wonder what other writers are there, what other worlds exist, and how do we find them? And so I think that, translation is definitely about the act of matching, stories, having the author be the continuation or the translator be the continuation of the author. And yet I also think that there's also an element of exploration to go out and try to find what is out there. Because if you love literature, if you love a country, then you think there must be something good there. And that's a very scary and yet very rewarding process. And so that's part of what I was doing in this Hindi publishing house, reading through many different books to see does anything speak to me, how much do I like this, and also trying to get a sense of what the Hindi literary culture is like, which is in some ways very different than our own. And it's, eventually, at some point, it's also an act of faith. You just have to keep on reading and think you're going to find something. And this is where I think I can bring it back to the panel and maybe some, aspects of cultural difference. We all love India. That's great for finding a literature. Then the problem is that we also kind of understand some of the complexities, and that adds to the literary weight. But the problem is some, say, Americans may not understand some of those same complexities. And so I always think, would my brother like this story? Because he's completely opposite from me in every way. And so maybe I'd like to just kind of open up to some of the cultural difficulties, maybe issues of just actually, on the page, the words, trying to find the equivalents, the more practice and active translation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, translation, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's sort of these twin misconceptions out there in our culture about translation. One is that it's a sort of kind of pretty simple mathematical process of moving one set of stable signs from one language into another set of stable signs for another language, a kind of, machine translation, Google type of thing, that it's, relatively easy to make this kind of photocopy. And of course, a translation is not a copy, it's an original in itself, right? So when you have a translation, there's a good translation, at least, there's really nothing lost, it's a pure gain, because whereas before you had one original, now you have two originals. You have something that's rewritten in another language. Then there's this other idea out there that it's totally impossible, right? That translation, I mean, there's always going to be something lost. That, I mean, the act itself is somehow futile. There's this cliched notion of faithful, unfaithful. All these things are not particularly helpful when you're rolling up your sleeves and doing the day-to-day work of translation. I mean, really, it's a question of challenges and choices, and you're making lots of choices, right? You're weighing, different possibilities when you're confronted with a certain translation challenge. One of the particularities about translating South Asian Hindi literature and South Asian literature into English is you have to think about your audience in ways that you don't when you're translating, I would say, from French, because there are so many South Asians who speak English and who read English, and probably the largest market for readers of South Asian translated literature into English will be in South Asia. But if you think about that audience, they're going to have much more of a culture, they're going to have a deeper cultural understanding of probably the milieu of the story. So in some ways, you can get away with less translating, right? You can maybe leave a lot of words, like bhakti or references to the Ramayana or things like that in the original, and you can be pretty confident that your reader is going to get that. However, what I'm interested in is enlarging the conversation of literature and bringing in people from North America whose knowledge of South Asia may be confined to the, I know that there's a local brand of chai called Bhakti Chai that Uday and I were sort of laughing about a little bit over breakfast, and yoga and things like that. It's kind of a sort of vague notions out there, so you're going to have to do a lot more translating for those people, right? And one example that I've cited in something that I've written before is in The Girl with the Golden Parasol, a holiday comes up, Raksha Bandhan, right? Which is a very important holiday in India. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows the significance of it. It's where sisters tie a thread of affection on the wrists of brothers or those they consider as brothers, more or less. So I'm translating this, and I come across this Indian holiday that I have to ask myself, well, what does the reader need to know? What does my North American reader, let's say, need to know? Maybe it's enough to just kind of signal that it's an important Indian holiday, and that's enough. But in the story, there's actually a wonderful passage, the punchline of which depends on you understanding the mechanics of that holiday. It's a college campus love story. It's the story that Uday was talking about, and the guys are like hoping that the girls that they have crushes on don't tie the Rakhi on their wrist because that means like it's Platonicville, So I mean, it's this wonderful, beautiful passage there. So so that needs to be lost somehow. So I'm left with some choices here. Do I put a footnote in there? Raksha Bandhan is very important. Generally, I don't like to use footnotes because that gives it a more of an academic feel to the text. So in that case, I decided to sort of gloss it within the text. Give enough information within the text that hopefully the reader who didn't know about the holiday will know enough so that they can get the joke, but it won't feel too sort of pre-chewed for the person who already knows what it is. So lots of choices and decisions like this, and the great translator Gregory Rabasa, this Spanish translator, he once wrote something about how when he, maybe 10 years later he reads something that he wrote in English, he says, yeah, that guy kind of had a point, that was kind of interesting, he's not such a dumb guy. But if he reads something that he translated 10 years ago, he's pulling his hair out, he just kind of can't bear reading it. He's just like, oh, why did I make this choice? Why did I make that choice? I should have done it differently. So that just sort of points to that there's sort of no definitive translation of everything, that there are multiplicity of choices that, if you had to do it again, you might, pick a different word or make a different choice. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your experiences translating Miguel Hernandez? The Miguel Hernandez, the poet?
Ah, yes. Recently, in the last visit to Chicago, I had read poems of a couple of poems, not more. One of the poet from Spain is Miguel Hernandez. It's spoken like Miguel Hernandez. So I love those poems, and then I read the memoirs of Neruda and also some other biographies. And every time in the Lorca, and every time I had reference of this poet. And incidentally, last year, the back last year, I was there in Chicago and I was walking towards the Michigan Lake. And when coming back, I saw the New York Times bookshop, and in the front that book was there. So this is the first time after many years I got that book and now translating it. And I had posted few of his poems in my Facebook recently, and you can see the response. There's around hundreds, more than hundreds of people have shared it, and the big comments. So here it comes, it's not that someone is from Spain and had a miserable life and someone is translating him in India, and he died in 42, I think, and now I'm translating in 2015. So big difference, the time, the reality, social context, cultural difference, everything. And how come people just love it? So what are the reasons? I really fail to understand sometimes. And sometimes I remember this what Chomsky had said about the organic unity of human mind. So universality, not unity. Organic universality of human mind. So it's there. And it always works. Like today, I give you an example. This morning I was walking with Jason, and I saw one painter on the street side. He has painted the trunks of the trees. And it's just trunks of the trees and its texture, and especially the old trees. And I was fascinated in my village from the same kind of a texture. I told him, I asked him that should I tell this thing to the painter? He said, yeah, of course you should tell him. So I went there and I told him that I also like these trunks very much. And had I been a painter, I would have painted like this. So he said, no, I'm not the painter, he's my wife. I'm just here. But this is true. This is true. There are many things, you know, like we have the same feelings, and we can share it. So I think that has to be translated. I mean, retaining the soul of the original. Sorry. And sometimes it is done. And I was sorry for my throat, but let me complete it. I was teaching this theory of methodology of translation in JNU when I was 24 or 25 years of age. So I had very profound knowledge of what is the theory. But when I read this one incident of a symbolist poet, and he was Alexander Blok of Russia in 1910. And he was a freelancer like me. So he was translating a poem of 12 lines. And he was translating. He has put a coffee pot on stove, and it took around 2 hours to complete the text. And by then the coffee was burnt and the whole room was filled up with fume. And he got just saved itself. And he sent the translation text with the original to the editor of one famous magazine. And after a week, he returned it with a letter, and that possibly you have mistaken. You have translated a poem of 12 lines, and you have sent me a 3-page short story. So the answer for Alexander Blok was that you have misled by the difference of the genre. And it is the only possible way to translate that poem. So I think this is the way sometimes you feel like Borges. He has rewritten like Insomnia of Kafka, and the way he wrote it is just a small piece, but the way it has been rewritten, I think that is the best translation. So sometimes translation goes up to the extent of rewriting the original. Sometimes it's original, it's in it itself, and sometimes like we are taught. You have just be correct to the grammar, be literal to the words, and just produce a paragraph exactly the same in another language without altering or transposing or changing or transforming or recreating anything. So I think there is a difference between this kind of a translation and the other kind of a translation, and that difference should be always kept in the mind, is my feeling.
Yeah, Borges has a great quote about how sometimes he wishes that the original was as good as the translation. But maybe just coming back to a point about sort of universality and kind of cultural recontextualization, which, I mean, every good act of translation, I would say, sometimes involves kind of radical cultural recontextualization. But so The Girl with the Golden Parasol, I mean, is a very Indian story. It's very caste-based. You know, it's about a non-Brahmin boy who falls in love with a Brahmin girl, you know, taking place at this campus out in the sticks in the middle of nowhere in India. And it's, you know, it's very culturally specific. But I think that, you know, if you sort of zoom away a little bit, it's just a basic sort of universal underdog story, you know, that a story of kind of unrequited love that is unrequited because the sort of powers that be, I mean, in this case, the powers that be are the caste system in India that come down very hard on these two would-be young lovers. But that sort of story is very universal, that kind of underdog story, the kind of boy meets girl, and I think that's why, I mean, a lot of recontextualization had to be done for that book, but I think the basic outlines of the narrative are fairly universal there.
I have, one final question, which is actually, it might be a difficult question, so prepare yourself. I guess to preface it, when I was younger, I would go to the Barnes & Noble in Oklahoma City to buy books, and I quickly fell in love with Dostoevsky and a lot of the 19th century Russian writers. At the time, I was hardly thinking of the translator. It was just the author, and the author spoke very deeply to me. As I've gotten older, I've kind of wondered, why was it Dostoevsky? Why was it these Russians? And I think a lot of it was actually because some of the things which Dostoevsky talked about, some of the problems at that time, with rationalism, utilitarianism, the Eastern Orthodoxy, was actually very similar to what it was like growing up in Catholic school in Oklahoma. And so I totally got what he was saying. And yet somehow, through that emotional communication, I also began to learn way more about Russia and way more about Russian history and Russian culture. And that then led me to think, okay, so what are other Russian authors? And I started reading Turgenev and Chekhov and many more. So the question which I ask myself in terms of Hindi and translation is that India is a very complicated world. It's a different world than America. And I sometimes wonder, translations also have different time periods. They have different contexts in which it will click with a certain people. A lot of times a translation is really just a continuation of something which we're always kind of talking about, and that's why a 19th century author could touch me so deeply here in the 21st century. So maybe my question is, for the types of works which you're doing in Hindi, for a lot of the works which are happening in Bengali, Telugu, any of the different languages, do you think that it will resonate with Americans? Do you think that that's something which they will also be able to, pick up and want to learn more deeply about in terms of the culture?
Well, I can definitely say that there are voices out there that I think would resonate very deeply with the American reading literary public, that just for various reasons having to do with this kind of ecosystem right now, this literary ecosystem that includes writers, translators, editors, publishers, and grant givers, maybe just as one little aside here, there's something called the German Book Office. I mean, here's a shocker, the Germans are very organized. And every year they put out this beautiful glossy pamphlet of books, hot books, great books in German that they think ought to be translated, right? And they provide subsidies for sample translations for publishers. So publishers can read a synopsis and just be like, wow, this sounds great. I think this could be a great title. Well, needless to say, nothing like this exists in India, partly because there's so many different languages, partly also because I don't think the government could get it together to do something like that. In any case, so there are all these different places in this ecosystem that a lot of things need to happen, a lot of coincidences, a lot of happenstances, a lot of people falling in love with writing, the right translator, the right text for something like the book to the voice to be heard, and it has to be promoted well, etc., etc. But I think that there are lots of wonderful voices. One of my favorite writers is a Tamil writer named Charu Nivedita. I mean, I would recommend everyone to read this book of his called 0 Degree, published by this wonderful small publishing house called Blaft. Just incredible, wild stuff. So there are lots of voices out there. There's a wonderful Bangla translator named Arunava Sinha who's doing a lot of work, some stuff coming out with Archipelago and some other US presses. But yeah, so I don't see any reason why, well, maybe I do in some ways. I mean, I think that some of the more kind of immigration narratives to the US, that is a kind of subgenre of South Asian writing in English. There's a little bit more of like a toehold, something for the American reader to kind of hang on to. But I mean, I have full faith in the American reader. They're gonna see these voices. They might be more challenging than some of the voices that are coming through today. But I think that there are lots of exciting voices that could make a difference. Whether that's going to turn them on, they're going to start traveling to India and reading more. I don't know about that, but who knows?
I was with Charu Nivedita, he's just referred the name, and he's a Tamil writer, he's a wonderful writer, and I was with him in Bhubaneswar recently. And he was telling me about his life, what is happening with him. So I stopped writing in Tamil now. The way he has written is a wonderful text, 0 degree. He is almost outcast, and he has become a black sheep in his own literary establishment. So he now writes in Malayalam, just for survival. So you can imagine. And his novel has been really appreciated well, because through English, other Indian language readers can read it. Otherwise, he would have been unknown to other language writers. So we could read him through English, because we can't read Tamil. So India has more than 24 languages, you know it, which are the official languages. And then there are 200 languages spoken in this vast populated country after China. So
maybe we should open for questions.
Yeah,
We have
sure,
a few
sure.
minutes left.
I'm sure there are questions people have. I'll give you the microphone. Excuse me. I'm sorry. We'll have to pass, please.
I'm really struck by the daunting task of translating, because it occurs to me that you need to be good readers of the second language and good observers of both cultures, your own and the other, and then a good writer in English. So that has me wonder, how does it work when the translated author actually is bilingual? So why he can speak English, why didn't Uday translate his own book? But I'm sure it has to do with, I'm wondering what the pitfalls are of that. Maybe there's a great beauty in a whole nother person translating even the in-between of it. So that's my question.
Right. I would say a few things. I would say that, what you said is all true. I mean, you have to, have read widely in both the source language and the language that you're writing into. I would say probably it's more important to be a good writer into the target language, right? Because you can know, you could be the world's foremost expert on Hindi literature, but if you're a crappy writer in English, it's just not going to sound great. I would say that historically, writers who have tended to translate themselves, usually it doesn't work out so well, even if they are absolutely fully bilingual, whatever that means. Usually the results are much better if somebody, there's just like another perspective. I mean, as a writer, it's a wonderful experience. It's like writing with the greatest number of constraints. In a way, it's the purest form of writing, because you're really only concerned about the language. And what comes next and all that other stuff, someone else is already taking care of that. You're thinking about audience, but it's in a way it's really pure, the purest form of writing, I would say. Yeah.
Speaking of your personal experience, how difficult was Hindi for you?
I mean, people always. Because no one thinks about Hindi in this country, very few people, and Hindi, that must be the most. It's not the most difficult language in the world. I mean, I'm a Hindi teacher, so of course I'm paid to say that. My students learn Devanagari in a week. It's the world's most user-friendly script. Scientifically organized. The grammar itself, verbs are incredibly regular. Compared to French, I would take Hindi any day of the week when it comes to verb regularity. So, there are some difficult things. Indirect verb constructions and complementizers and sort of, the huge variety of, Hindi once you kind of zoom out of the Khadi Boli sort of thing. So it's another language. It's like adopting a child. It's a commitment. But it's not the most, I think Russian is far more difficult. German is probably more difficult. I don't know. It depends.
I can maybe also chime in as someone who's kind of in between. I've studied Hindi for several years now, but I'm also not a teacher. And this also goes back to the previous question, because to be a translator, you've got to do a lot of things simultaneously. When I was in India, I felt like I was just constantly bombarded by how little I knew of Hindi. And part of that is also because of the type of Hindi we learn here in the United States. Language, it's standardized into textbooks. You learn certain words for certain concepts. And then you go over to India with your list of vocabulary and you use it. And suddenly everybody says, we haven't used that word in like 100 years. What are you doing? So that's one aspect. A second aspect is also, for the richness of the language and the literature. Again, the type of Hindi which we've learned has been kind of incredibly standardized, and it's come from, I think maybe I'm like entirely historically correct, but there's certain scholars went in and then that created communication with certain peoples so that there are other castes, other communities, other villages, other towns which use different dialects. And then within the language itself, you have a lot of literature which is written using those dialects to give it, much more color and vibrancy. And so, as somebody who's learning the language, I always feel, very, I guess, unfulfilled because it's difficult for me to understand, what they're saying. And the second is also just what they say. There's such a great, colorful, bird-like quality to Hindi that you really have to learn, the language not just through your mind and your eyes, but also through your ears. And as someone who always just, read and memorized things, that was very difficult. It still is very difficult for me.
Question right here.
I have a question here. As an author, do you have to make a choice between the richness of the language and the number of audience you have? Probably Hindi would be a richer language for you to express. But if you see the English has larger audience base, so as a author, does he ever have to make that choice?
No, I tell you very honestly, I never thought which language I am writing in. Because I was born in the border of Chhattisgarh and my mother tongue was Chhattisgarhi. So learning Hindi, Khadi Boli, the official language, we started from schools. And I was not very confident because I belong to an area where not good Hindi is spoken. And I can cite one example when he came in 2005 after getting this Pen grant. And incidentally, we were invited as a guest for the inauguration of the memorial of one great poet of Hindi, Mukti Bodh. So we drove all the way around, say, 1100 kilometers on road, and we reached there, and the chief minister was there of the state, and all ministers and officials, and we were made to sit just beside the chief minister, me and Jason. And when Jason spoke just few sentences, I told 10,000 of people, they started applauding. So, and the next morning, every newspaper had him on the cover. It's true.
It is true.
Yeah.
And the story went that I was an African-American writer who had learned Hindi after reading Uday Prakash in Benares.
So, and when we were coming back, we went to get some petrol for our car. So those, in the petrol stations in India, those boys who work for filling it. So he came and he showed him the newspapers, that everywhere your photograph is there, and he identified him. So this is the way, I never thought before that I am going to be really accepted in another language by other people. And here I want to end my answer with what Borges had said. It's a very important thing. He said that when I write, I don't think which language I am writing in, and I don't know who is going to read it, and possibly a reader is on the other corner of the earth, and possibly is not now, he may exist in future. So this way, and now I have been translating, like the scholar is sitting there beside the wall. He is from Germany, and I have met him many a times. He was my host. And I have 5-6 books in German, and I have 16 translators, very good translators in German. And I knew none of them. So they picked me up, they choose my short story, and they're translating it. So this can happen in any language, with any writer. And like singer, Isaac Wasabi's singer, he wrote in a language which is a dead language. So people ask him, why do you write in this language? He said, because I want only ghosts to read me.
I'm so sorry.